Scott Stephenson is the founder of SGS Capital and former chairman and president and CEO of Verisk Analytics. Scott is the founder, well, I just said that. He serves on several for-profit and not-for-profit boards, including PEG, which is part of NICE, Definitive Healthcare, which is part of NASDAQ, the Bowery Mission, which he chairs, the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and and let's not forget, the University of Virginia School of Data Science, where he chairs our advisory board, and we're all exceedingly grateful for the advice that he gives us. Scott is a signatory of the Business Roundtable Statement on the Purpose of a Corporation, and during his tenure as CEO of Verisk Analytics, Forbes recognized Scott as one of America's most innovative leaders and as one of the top 25 most innovative leaders worldwide. Along with his wife, Beth, he established the Stephenson Dean of Data Science at UVA chair, which I'm currently sitting in, more or less. He has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from UVA, so one of our very own. So thank you very much for being here, Scott. And I think the idea was for you to make some opening statements, and then perhaps you and I have a bit of a conversation, and then from there onwards we can take questions from the floor.
Thank you, Phil. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's just so encouraging to know that that our beloved university is the home of this event, but also that there are so many folks that are interested in the topic or topics, and that's really the point, is that data science and the application of data to the world's opportunities and challenges is multidimensional, and just naturally works its way into almost every topic at this point. I cannot go to a business gathering of senior CEO level business people or industry associations without there being a panel discussion, if not even more of the day being given over to matters of AI, generative AI, et cetera. And so these topics that you and Ian were just talking about are very alive and very active in the private sector. And I would say that, maybe in line a little bit with your thought about sort of eras and developments and the way that they play out over time. We've been inside of the information revolution for, as it relates to broadly in the commercial world, probably shortly after, the dawn of the computational age, as you called it, Phil, von Neumann and the work he did. And then we had some early implementations of companies that were trying to take advantage of that. But, sort of the advent of the PC revolution, and now it's sort of moved out, more broadly in the world, and the advent of the internet. I mark those things as starting 40, 45 years ago. And my point here would be that what's going on right now, the degree of interest in the category broadly stated in the private sector has never been higher. You cannot as the CEO of a bank or a manufacturing company or what have you, you didn't grow up probably harnessing data methods, certainly not the data methods that we make use of today. And yet that you can't not talk about it, and that it's a very active point inside of your company. And honestly, I think companies are at some level struggling to know how they should get on with this revolution that's taking place. And the reason is that companies generally have, when you're talking about a specific methodology, companies generally have two ways that they go about it. One is they create a priesthood of people who will sit in the middle of the company, in the center of the company, and basically come from subject matter expertise and basically represent the methodology into their organization And in that mode, they try to encourage and they try to influence, but they do it from outside of the core processes that are at work in a company. And then the other way that it's approached is more of kind of a broad-based educational kind of an approach, where the thought is we need to actually steep a lot of our colleagues in these new methods. And each of those approaches has something to say for it. The first one is kind of more efficient, but the second one is probably more effective in the long run. And then you're always trying to match resource and expense to where your company has to be. And so it actually becomes rather complex. How are you if you would like to see generative AI more at work in your company, literally, what is the pathway by which you cause it to happen? And I think we're still in the early innings of companies figuring that out. So against that backdrop, I believe that folks that take the time to educate and constantly re-educate themselves in at least the rudiments of the latest methodologies become people who are very, very constructive and useful in the world. And so something like Datapalooza as an encouragement in that direction is terrific. And then the other thing I would say is, just as we get started here, I think that one of the very most advantaged commercial behaviors, probably in the academy as well, but definitely in the commercial world and the private sector, is great agility and ability to capture data which grows up either inside of your own company or outside of your own company, but to capture it and to quickly begin to mine the signals that are embedded in the data. And the reason I say this is because of what's blindingly obvious to everybody, and that is there has been an explosion in the amount of data which is available. And so the potential to find new signals, maybe in your own operations, the markets that you serve, among the people that work with your company, and then everything that grows up outside. The potential that there's something there that will boost your understanding of something that's critical to your business is greater than it's ever been. And the other thing is the cost of actually being somebody that is really leaning into data and trying to take advantage of it. It's never been more efficient to be able to do that. As Phil knows, if he and I had gone out, let's say 25 years ago, and we wanted to get a petabyte of storage capacity, it would have cost us about $8 million. And had we done that, had we had the imagination to think, okay, a petabyte of data, like, oh, that would be good to have. What would it, where would I get it? What would it take? But the fact that it would cost you an $8 million investment in storage would make it into a project that you would have to go and you'd have to argue for. And a lot of people that grew up in my generation just did not, they didn't know how to make those arguments. And so they didn't really get on with it. But today, if Phil and I wanted to get a petabyte of storage capacity, we'd probably go rent it in the cloud for about $15,000 a year. And it's interesting also, over the same time period, if you wanted to exploit that petabyte of data 25 years ago, you probably would have hired a database administrator, and, they kind of got paid what they got paid, 25 years ago, maybe $50,000, something like that. Today, if you want to exploit your data assets, you're really going to think about a data scientist, sometimes data engineers, but, and these kinds of folks are highly sought after. A great data scientist with just even a couple of years of experience could easily get paid $250,000 or more. And so it's just really interesting how the economics have shifted. But my point here is simply that the premium goes to, if you're in front of data and you have the right to do so, grab the data and start to mine it. That is a very constructive behavior in the modern world, in the modern commercial world. So why don't I stop there, Phil?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate your insightful comments. I would say when you get to be as old as I am, what you described was a massive amount of storage back then. I used to run a whole department at the medical school at Columbia on a machine that had 4 megabytes of physical memory.
Right.
No one wants to hear that anymore. When I mention that to students, their eyes just glaze over. Grandpa's going on a rant, this kind. So I've given up on all of that, although of course I just did it. So anyway, but the model you mentioned about how things are operating in companies where there's like this core group of people versus the infusion throughout the organization. I find that really interesting. I mean, in the sense that in terms of what we're doing in academia, as you know, because you're so closely associated with us, we are in the business of infusion. So we're trying to infuse our model of data science, or data science more generally, across all the other schools and departments within the university. It's not something that we feel we need to own. And I think it seems to be working for us. So I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that anymore. If not, I have plenty of other things I want to ask you.
Well, just to say that for-profit entities are acutely aware of the need to balance expense and investment with outcomes and profitability. And I actually, maybe in the way I teed it up, I may have given evidence of my own bias, which is that the infusion model is much more reliable and has much better long-term outcomes. But two things are true. It's also it's a longer lead time agenda. And so if you're really concerned about where are we right now in terms of expense and outcomes and results and the bottom line as well as the top line, you can certainly understand the temptation to think that, well, if we can just hire a Jan LeCun and now they'll sort of cause us to be in the right place, that can be a comforting thought to a CEO, somebody that's allocating capital and expense dollars. So one, and then two, I would say that one of the comments I've heard most frequently from general managers inside of businesses as it relates to the generative AI moment is, it's kind of the, well, I'm not going to get fooled way of thinking, which is basically, well, yeah, but I heard that story about the lawyer who submitted a brief in a legal matter, and it was generated entirely by generative AI, and it was wrong, and they lost the case. So don't let your people get ahead of the methods. It's kind of like, don't become overly dependent on it too fast. And if you have that cast of mind, then you're gonna be a little bit more interested in a couple of priests who understand the power of what they're dealing with, rather than sort of putting it in a lot of hands in a relatively unsupervised way and kind of hoping that nothing goes wrong. So I guess you could lump that under the heading of risk. And if you're kind of risk averse, you might lean a little bit more into the priesthood model than the infusion model.
Mm-hmm. No, I accept that. I mean, it was interesting because I think the conversation we had with Ian, there was also this notion of, which you just brought up in a sense again, which is the sort of human in the loop. The idea that there really needs to be that iterative process. Right. You can't just rely on the technology. And I think that's really important, which then leads me to sort of ask a question. If I look around the room here, I'm not sure if you can see the room, but there's a lot of young people here and a lot of students and more senior people as well. So I'm just wondering if you could, from your perspective in the private sector, what are you looking for in this new future, and as we are today and going forward? What do you look? What should, you already touched upon this in terms of mining data, but I wonder if there's more to say about how the students should be thinking about this future and what they should be doing to prepare for it.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. If we were to focus on one's viability out in the work world, in other words, employability and readiness to take on jobs, in the private sector, I would say that there are more people who have facility with respect to the methods than there are people who are actually focused on changing things by making use of the methods. And so, to try to render that concrete, when at least where I used to work until last year, when we were looking at hiring people who had skill and background in the methodologies, really sort of the dividing line in terms of who it was we wanted to hire was not so much, we might give them a coding problem or we might give them an analytic problem, and they do what they do. There's a lot of talent out there with respect to those kinds of things. But is this a person that actually is really interested in trying to make a difference in the world with these methods? And even more, do they have specific use cases that are especially, particular outcomes that are really interesting to them? And they really, really want to put energy into pursuing those outcomes. So, folks that bring the methodological, yes, but also actually are very applied and are looking to be applied and can get really excited about a domain and, the human activity inside of that domain, like that was really attractive to us when we were hiring people at Verisk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks a lot. You actually made me, another element of this, which we ask ourselves, which we've discussed with the board as well, is this notion of going forward of data engineers versus data scientists. And I don't know what you're observing in that context, whether there's anything to be said there at this point, or maybe that these things are just sort of, in a way, I know the gray area just gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah, well, I think you answered your own question. I mean, companies need to and will continue to hire people that are defined in both of those categories. And actually, there's a fair amount of energy that goes into trying to define these buckets, basically. And there's a third bucket, which is kind of a business analyst. And they all sort of are aiming in the end towards the same thing, but they end up being different job descriptions. So I think that those kinds of categories will persist. And, a person can start in any one of those buckets. But I think that if you start out more methodological, fundamental, you're just going to have to find ways to balance your experience with getting closer to customers, closer to use cases, et cetera. But if you start out as a business analyst, you're going to have to keep refreshing your technical skills. And so it is great. And that's just the way it is, because companies need some logic by which they define what it is that people are doing, and they come up with pay scales and what have you. So, it'll still be that way. And I wouldn't advise the young people in our meeting here today to be overly concerned about which bucket you start out in, but you should think of yourself as being able to serve in any one of those buckets.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I can see nodding heads here. So we've touched on generative AI as a futures in the private sector. I'm wondering as an investor, what other kinds of things that technologies and things that you're seeing that you think are really going to make a difference in the 5 to 10 year time frame. I mean,
you mentioned several of them in your opening comments. I'll circle a couple of them. One is I do think that the availability of data, which is just automatically generated by intelligent sensing devices and then communicated in telemetric ways, so that they're basically something is constantly describing itself, is huge. And I would relate to that also remote imagery, including from space and the, the greater precision of the signals that we can mine there. I mean, these are just powerful trends that are just going to keep going and going. And, Ian mentioned climate change. I mean, I really, we haven't seen it yet, but I really think that someday we will have what I would call the Internet of Nature, which is basically so many things in the natural order are actually instrumented in a way that they talk to us. Trees and plants, and let your imagination run wild. Strain gauges on fault lines, and you can go on and on. But basically, I think that that's super rich and kind of bottomless. So I definitely point towards those. One category you didn't mention that is really of interest to me is what I would call human augmentation. In the same way that, and there are many, many forms of human augmentation. Some of them are, and I would always love to be able to be the fly on the wall in DARPA research meetings, because I know that they're working on things like, well, how do we make it that, our soldiers in the field don't have to sleep for 48 hours without losing effectiveness, or injury which heals much quicker, or a lot of things like that. So there are many dimensions of human augmentation, but the one I would call out for our group here at this meeting today would be more if you think of a human being as a computational device, which is way underselling who we are, but just in that frame. Well, whenever you've been thinking about computers, you're always thinking about ROM, RAM, and processor. And, it's just kind of interesting to think about, well, what are the ways that we will be augmenting ourselves 5, 10, 20 years from now? Those that are effective, I'm sure, are going to be very, meaningful and profitable and, very noteworthy. But, it strikes me that we've already sort of collectively created a ROM capacity that we didn't used to have, and that is basically the internet. I mean, think about the number of things where, I can't remember what that was, but I know that I have confidence that I can go and find it. So in a way, we've sort of outboarded ROM a little bit. But when you think about RAM and processing, I mean, inside, between the two ears of a human being, we haven't done that much yet, but I fully expect that will come. So in addition to the other subdomains that you mentioned, I would call out human augmentation. And I would also say, for a school like ours, for a dean like you, Phil, who really cares about the ethical dimensions of data and data analytics, if we're going to augment human beings, I think we get into massive ethical issues really fast, for which we're probably not prepared.
Yeah, I was just reading an article just yesterday about a company, I think it's called Humane, which is a bit of an odd name because they've developed these devices that sort of sit here. They're not actually implants or anything, but they create a whole new augmented experience, which does away with keyboards and things. You actually can see images in your hand and so.
Yeah, I/O, just changing I/O.
Yeah. It's all coming. But you actually made me think of another aspect that we didn't touch on directly, but it was inferred, I guess, in a number of things, which is really the Internet of Things. When I think about I was talking about this fifth paradigm where it was like multiple scales. Another sort of example of that is multiple scales where you're actually, what we don't have right now is we don't have necessarily the integration between a lot of different elements across scales, so which is really what the Internet of Things is pointing to. Of course, that in itself generates huge amounts of data. I don't know if you're seeing much of that in the marketplace. I'm sure.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, there are some categories where those kinds of signals are, because they're relatively newer, the difference-making signals when you're trying to analyze something. So, absolutely. And I would just share something that I've come to see as a bit of an iron rule in the world of data analytics, and that is the supply of data inevitably creates demand for data. And why is that? Well, it's the FOMO effect. There's a new data type that's in the world. I'm competing with 5 other companies. I don't want to be the only one of the six that isn't, mining the value of this new data type. So that's what I mean when I say supply of data inevitably creates demand for data, because of FOMO. Yeah, at the minimum, FOMO. You want to understand if there's anything there. And so when you think about the Internet of Things, you think about the number of things in the world. You think about the relative ease with which we can instrument inanimate things in order for them to be generating data. We're going to continue to just have explosive amounts of addition to the data that are available to us. And in that world, the growing supply will inevitably create demand. It's not that everything will be equally valued, but it is going to keep going.
Yeah, no question. Let's take some questions from the floor. I'm not sure, do we have the ability to do questions from people online as well? We do. I see nodding. Any questions in the room? Don't be shy. Here's an opportunity to talk to someone who's very prominent in the private sector and is an outstanding data scientist.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I was wondering, so as generative AI and these other advanced data-driven technologies kind of saturate our society, what would you say is the role of the corporate world or the business world in shaping the ethics behind their use, and how can they reconcile that with their interest in profit?
Yeah, well, so great question. The first thing I want to say is, I think the most important public policy matter, which will apply in the coming years, and Phil's heard me say this before, is the regulation of artificial intelligence. And I would say particularly whether or not the United States and Europe come up with an aligned view on all of that. I mean, it's just an interesting fact of the matter that if you ask the average American how do they feel about technology, including AI, they tend to have a fairly negative view of it. If you ask the average citizen of the People's Republic of China how they feel about these methods, they have a generally positive view of them. So you just start with these differences. We could talk about why. And then you overlay that with, especially in Europe, Europe is always the place where a high degree of concern about privacy grows up fastest. In other words, I look at public policy that's getting made in Europe, and I expect it to travel over to the United States with maybe a 2 or 3 or 5 year kind of a delay. Just the European society is more concerned about privacy. Yet, the Western economies collectively are founded upon a certain view of the overall availability of data and the balance between private initiative and public initiative, distinct from, for example, a place like China. And so the way that we actually end up regulating these methods will have huge implications for how available are they, how costly are they, what can they be used for, et cetera. So I know your question is about individual companies and what can they be doing. But I just want to lead in talking about this by saying that I actually think that the public sector is going to speak most loudly with respect to these matters. And it's not at all clear to me that the United States plus Europe are collaborating in a way that we can get to aligned views that will ultimately create the greatest amount of benefit for the greatest number of human beings. So that's where a lot of my thinking goes towards. I think that what the first best thing that a private company can do in these matters is to be transparent, to just be open about how the company is doing what it's doing, basically, and to feel itself accountable for being for both disclosing and feeling ownership over the methodologies that are being used. There are ways that a company can talk about whether or not its machine learned methods have the effect of perpetuating bias that we don't want, because they were trained on, the methods were trained on data sets from a time where there was, say, more bias. I mean, I'm using a simple example, but there are ways that companies can describe that, and so I think the first best thing that a company can do is just to be really transparent about all that.
Yeah.
To offer descriptions of itself.
So you made me, right at the beginning, we were talking about the importance of, it's around 9 o'clock, seems like a long time ago now, with respect to public-private partnership. And in relation to Ethan's question, I'm thinking that there is a role, it would seem, that for universities to play with the private sector when it comes to these kinds of considerations. So that I think the global aspects and the governance and the legislation and everything that needs to happen is critically important, to your point. But I'm wondering what we can do sort of as a university, because it strikes me, and correct me if you feel differently about this, but we have a sort of scope of people within an academic environment that really is broader than exists typically in a company with respect to thinking about this. So, the companies might have ethicists to work to deal with this and think about it, but we have that. Plus, we have anthropologists, we have historians, we have all these sort of people that really study these things, and it just seems like the translation. There's more opportunity for translation into how companies think about these things than we're currently taking advantage of.
Agreed. Yeah, I lean in that direction, Phil, and I would just observe that there's an interesting. It's not a complete convergence. It's far from a complete convergence, but it is interesting how, at least some companies, they tend to be larger. They tend to be more tech forward. Have sort of taken on more of an educational mission defined within what they're trying to do as a company, where in part because the methods are changing and you would like your team to be getting on with the new methods as rapidly and as effectively as possible. One of the ways that you can do that is to help train and retrain and retrain the people that are at your company. And there is more of that than there used to be. So there is more teaching that's going on inside of companies than used to be the case. And I say I would expect more of that, because in some of these methods, the leading work is actually being done inside of the companies, not inside of the academy. And so you've got that as, kind of one side of the equation. But the other side of the, and it's very easy to see it, by the way. It's very easy to see it. I can just remember all these meetings I would be in where we would talk about, okay, well, we want to be leaning into our cloud architecture. All right, we need more cloud architects. Okay, where do we go to hire cloud architects? Are they being birthed from the academy? Well, no, not generally. Okay. So basically what you get to pretty quick is, well, okay, we can try to go hire Google or Microsoft's cloud architects. We could do that. It's expensive, and it's uncertain. And you basically put your future in somebody else's hands, meaning you grow good cloud architects, and then I'll try to hire away from you. Yeah, there's a dependency there that's not really all that comfortable for a business person. So the alternative is, we'll teach people to be cloud architects, hire them as great athletes and teach them to be cloud architects. And we did that. So business is crossing more over into education, but then in the other direction, the academy becoming more applied. And so part of the learning process itself is application. And of course, that's always been an element of, say, the master's program at the School of Data Science. I would expect more and more of that as well. It's a good thing. And it would be a good thing for universities to be able to organize themselves so that they in this cross-disciplinary way, it's easier to say than it is to do it, but in this cross-disciplinary way, they become yet more places where the learning is experiential by doing. And so I think it's not an overlap, but I think there will continue to be some convergence. And I think that's healthy. So borderless within the university, but also kind of semi-borderless in relating to, the business world. The more we can be semi-borderless in relating to the business world, I'm sure the more our School of Data Science will do well.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that what you're asking for and what we're actually trying to do as best we can in an environment that doesn't, hasn't in the past necessarily lent itself in quite the same way. But this interplay with the private sector, and it's bi-directional, as you're pointing out, I think is really important. Do we have other questions from the audience? It's a big chance. Got a couple over here.
I have one over here.
Good morning. My name is Brady. I'm working for DoD at the moment, and I'm applying to the master's program. I wanted to ask your thoughts on either your observations or others, and you've talked to in the business community, on how data science might feed to go beyond the looking for new signals, looking for insights, to talking about prediction or more particularly innovation. Thanks.
Sorry, what was the very last word there, Brady?
I'm sorry?
Prediction or
innovation.
prediction?
Innovation.
Oh, innovation. Yeah. Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Basically, we've had heuristic methods forever, and it's not as if they're going to go away. That's a way that human beings make order out of, where we happen to be at the moment. But a lot of the action is stochastics. A lot of the action is prediction. And, I find this a very interesting movement, because one of the things that the average human being is not actually very good at is thinking probabilistically. And so when we're making predictions, we obviously have to be thinking about confidence interval, and it's just not, people that are in the world of trying to interpret data, may start out there. But if we start to try to drive our decisioning more based upon, the stochastic methods. They're used in a lot of places. I'm not saying it's novel. They're used in a lot of places. But if now with the most recent turn of the wheel, much larger data sets, more efficiently assembled, if we start to lean into predictions as the basis of our decision making more, first of all, I just think, it'll be interesting to see how that matches up with human experience, but also like what happens the first time. If you think about it, for example, a self-driving car is a prediction machine. And, if when self-driving cars become widely available, and it doesn't, it could be that they're considerably safer than human beings driving them, but like what attention is given to the one where on its own, the ADAS basically drove the car off the cliff. And then all of a sudden, there's congressional hearings, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that inevitably we will be leaning more into prediction. My question is more like, what will our comfort level be with driving our decision-making primarily based upon the predictions? And will we get better at thinking and talking probabilistically so that we can talk about confidence?
Thanks. When you talk about autonomous vehicles, which I have one, it makes me immediately think of the human in the loop, because it's pretty scary without that. As they are getting better, but there's still a long way to go. But just hearing from someone from the DoD also made me think that there's, we've talked about public-private, but there's also government, and there's also NGOs, and all of that is in the ecosystem that we haven't really touched upon, the interrelationship with governments and so forth. But there was another question over there.
Over here.
Oh, somewhere.
This one? Yeah. Hello. Thank you for speaking. I have a general question about seems there's often a gap between the people who are making decisions and have access to the data and can sign off on things, and the people who understand how that could be used in creative or novel or important ways. And specifically, I think there was a little bit fuzzy on the details, but my understanding is that Google kind of already invented like LLMs like years before OpenAI did. They just sat on them for a couple of years. So,
Right.
in general, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, the innovation process is as much art as it is science. I think that the topic that you raised is so resonant for me because I was leading an organization of 10,000 people. We would spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on building things. But I always felt that what I was always concerned about was, would my own lack of imagination cause me to lean in less or make less resource available to something that, was actually very worthwhile. And so the one way that I felt I could discipline not only myself, but also our organization on exactly this point was by making it clear to all of the people at our company that, look, we're investment minded. We want to lean into, and we're very much innovation driven. Our future we're only going to have a future if we're innovative. I would talk about that a lot. One of the ways, if you're the boss, one of the ways that you show your commitment to innovation is your willingness to spend on it. In other words, if you say to your organization, hey, we want a lot of innovation, and then, the first 10 ideas that come forward, all of them require a certain level of spending to get after them. And you find very reasonable bases for saying, well, no, we're not going to do that. Thank you for the idea. We're not going to do that. At some point, you're going to train your organization to believe that you don't really mean it. That, yeah, I'm asking for innovation, but I don't really mean it because I'm not willing to spend, anything on it. Okay, so if you, first of all, you have to get the tone right. But then beyond that, I would say one discipline that I felt was actually very helpful to us was to say to somebody who's trying to innovate, great. The resources are going to flow to you when you can identify a customer who is willing to be your development partner on this. In other words, you have been able to get somebody outside of our company who potentially could be a customer, maybe even a partner, but normally we were thinking in terms of customers. If you can get just one excited enough about the idea that they will essentially enter the development lab with you and be a part of the work we're doing, okay, then that's kind of a proof point that we'll organize around. And so here, now you're supported and here comes the resource, et cetera. That was a very helpful discipline, I found. And I think that, so your Google example, let's see, would it have worked? So, okay, you're working on generative AI. Yeah, no, I think that would have worked. Show me some party external to us that is interested enough in this topic to come work with us on it. And then your project gets more support and visibility. I think it probably would have worked in that case too. It's a pretty good discipline.
I really like that approach. We have one more quick question, and then I want to ask if you have anything just to close with. Someone got the mic over? Oh, sorry. Did we preempt someone else? Sorry.
Hey, good morning. My name is Courtney, and I'm an associate registrar here for course operations at UVA. And I'm wondering, if you're thinking about R&D, what top 3 areas would you invest in? And would it include AI, quantum computing, and blockchain?
No, not.
And why?
I definitely would not include blockchain in my top 3. And the reason is that basically, that the distributed ledger has its issues in terms of efficiency, but what you get in return is the lack of, and a governance on top of that constrains the participants in the ecosystem. And you say it that way, okay, well, what's wrong with that? Well, nothing, but basically, if you have, the notion of a centralized registry rather than a distributed ledger, and if you have a registrar for the data that you really have confidence in, then actually that's more efficient. And you've also got a party speaking into the ecosystem to maybe even improve the data which are being made available. So I think we've just had it demonstrated that we've seen it over the last several years that, distributed ledger methodologies have had these sort of niche applications, but they haven't really become all that powerful. So, maybe there's a thesis, which is that the efficiency of those methods can go way up, and also that the, kind of like the definition of the payload can become agile enough that it is sort of more flexible and evolutionary, what have you. But I don't think the probability of that is all that high. So I would not have blockchain on my list. I would definitely have generative AI on my list. I would definitely have quantum computing on my list. And then, I really, it's really, man-machine interface is kind of the third domain that strikes me as the most important. So those would probably be my big three.
Thanks a lot, Scott. We're going to have to move on in a sec. Is there any one final thought you want to leave us with?
Yes, I'll give you two, and particularly, Phil, given that we're talking about futures. So my first one is, I think that the net effect of the generative AI large language model moment will be to, and let's revisit this at Datapalooza 5 years from now, will be to cement, if not expand, the primacy of the English language around the planet. And the reason why, and I'm sure many in the room already are aware of the fact that, about 60% of all web pages are authored in English. And number two is Russian, I think, at around 6%, and Spanish is around 5%. And it's interesting that the character-driven languages, Japanese, Chinese, et cetera, are down. They're bigger economies, but they're down lower. There's something about wanting to stay very close to the leading edge of innovation, and one of the big movements is the language models. And the language models are going to get trained on something, and the scale data you're going to call on, a lot of it is going to come from public sources like the web. And so I think that there will be a cementing, if not expanding, importance of English globally, at least in the business and research domain. So that's very good news for somebody that is born an American citizen, because you grow up speaking English. It's an advantage. It's a major advantage. And the other one is, I think that the long-term effect of the most recent AI innovations and those that will be coming next, with respect to the global economy overall, is implicitly deflationary. In other words, there will be more automation and efficiency inside of roles, knowledge working roles, that previously just weren't really going to be touched. And so it used, the jobs that got automated were first physical, mechanical, and then a certain amount of sort of data entry kind of thing, sort of logging and reporting stuff, or pawing through stuff to make sure it's accurate. Some of those jobs have already gone away, but now we're going to be moving more into interpretation and then response generation. And so there will be categories of jobs that are the more high-paying ones that will increasingly be influenced by these developments. And so I find myself wondering if the net essential effect is deflationary. And then what does that mean for us?
Yeah, that's really insightful. It makes me think in ways that I hadn't before, which is, of course, exactly what we wanted to happen in this session. And we're deeply grateful, Scott, for you spending the time with us. It really is an honor to have you here and to have you talk to us. I think it will have a huge impact
Thank you.
on
Thank
what
you
we
for
do.
inviting me.
Of course.
The very best to everybody that's in our company today at this event. I think you're on the. I just applaud you for investing in your own capabilities and perspective. I think it's fabulous.
And we'll applaud you now. Thanks very much.